Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be starting in a few minutes. We will be holding all questions to the end, so thank you for joining us. I do realize that we might not be able to answer everyone's questions, so we thank you for your patience. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. The contact information for the panelists you see today is going to be listed in the handout section. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Gia.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I'm Gia Rosemarin. I'm a tax partner here at Witham, and we're excited to talk to you today about some of the considerations for remote employees. What does that mean for the company? Why do you care? I'm joined by my fellow panelists today, Jason Rosenberg, who is a senior manager in our state and local practice, and Jason has a specialty with income tax and nexus considerations, as well as Lady McNair, who leads our sales tax practice, and she obviously focuses on sales tax. The reason that we're having this presentation today, and maybe why you should care, is obviously in light of COVID, we're getting the question almost every single day, if not multiple times a day, what happens when I have employees that used to report to, for example, the New York office, and they are now working remotely? What does that mean for the company, and what should we be thinking about? There are many taxes and many considerations to be thinking about, but what we're going to focus on today is 3 specific taxes: payroll tax, sales tax, and income tax. And believe it or not, because the states are so complex, each and every one could have a different answer for all 3 of these types of taxes. So we'll throw some examples around today, but we just wanted to make you aware, and we're hoping that you walk away with today maybe some policies from your firm, and whether you want your employees to be able to just switch their withholding without your consent, or maybe it's a policy you should put in place where they need to contact HR. Really understand what it does mean for the company, where you have remote employees now working all over the country, and maybe even outside the country. So I'd like to just turn it over to Jason. Jason, why don't you just talk about like the current climate? What are you seeing in terms of the states, and give us a little background here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gia. And thanks everybody for joining today. And as we think about the current state and local climate, we're going to think about how it intersects with the wide-ranging state implications of remote work, as we discussed today. Just to kind of piggyback off of what Gia said, as we're seeing a rapid acceleration of the telecommuting environment, it's really imperative that businesses are reviewing, the myriad of state and local considerations as a result of a transformed workforce. So with that being said, when we think about the current climate of state and local tax, right, which is going to aid when evaluating company decisions and quantifying different risks, personal income taxes are often found to be the largest revenue raiser in most states, which simply just underscores the importance of employee withholding. COVID-19, as we've seen, has triggered a severe budget crisis across many of the states. While the full magnitude of this crisis is not yet clear, obviously, what is clear is that state revenues are drastically declining. And although official state revenue projections generally do not reflect the unprecedented fiscal impact of the coronavirus pandemic, what we are currently seeing is that fiscal budget offices in many states are analyzing, the revised economic projections and producing initial estimates of the damage, as a result of the shortfalls. So, that being said, just kind of taking this, a higher step, with the varying nonpartisan institutes, they're estimating that budget shortfalls will reach almost 10% in 2020 and 20% in the current fiscal year, meaning 2021, based on economic projections. So clearly the bottom line is that, the states, especially in the Northeast, California, and certain states throughout the country are really facing, budget shortfalls as a result of the pandemic. And, personal income tax, which we're going to discuss because that is payroll withholding, right? It affects personal income tax because it's the largest revenue stream that states use to collect taxes and their revenues. It's having a drastic effect. And so it's important to keep that in the back of our minds as we explore, remote teleworking, just to understand and have a good baseline of what we're seeing when we think about, what's going on in the current environment.
And ladies, similarly, I know Jason just talked about, personal income tax, but on the sales tax side, similarly, you're seeing shortfalls as well, right? Just kind of give us what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. I get the question to say, well, are the states being more forgiving now due to the pandemic, right? And I say, absolutely not. The states are so devastated revenue-wise, so they're more aggressive. And they're investing in hiring more people. And with their employees working from home, sometimes it's challenging enough on the audit side. But what I've seen for sales tax purposes, it's not a complicated issue. If you have payroll in a state, it obviously creates an excess, and obviously it triggers a company to look into the taxability of the product to see if it's subject to sales tax or not as next steps. Wayfair kind of made it easier a little bit because Wayfair forced most of the companies to register in most states, unless Florida or Missouri are the two states where there are no economic nexus. So what that means is if a company does not have nexus established in these two states, now they have payroll or people moving into the states, they would definitely have to consider the sales tax consequences. And what that means is they need to figure out whether or not what they're providing in the state is subject to sales tax. And if it is, should they be collecting sales tax? How much sales tax are we collecting? So it's definitely interesting times. I definitely think everyone should be aware of the sales tax consequences, even though not as drastic as for income tax purposes, because most of the companies should already be registered in the state, but definitely a big consideration.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is let's step back and say, okay, what does that mean for, a lot of people on this call don't even understand the concept of nexus, or, maybe we just jumped in, to sales tax and so forth. But let's go back to the payroll withholding for a minute. Jason, could you kind of just like run us through pre-COVID even? What were companies doing pre-COVID? And then we'll sort of like give examples on now the COVID world and what may be the new norm, and is temporary employees moving, are they coming back? And we can kind of jump into those and then circle back with Lady on the sales tax implications, which clearly need to be addressed as well. So let's start with payroll withholding. Pre-COVID, what was the norm?
Yeah, so let's go through some of the traditional rules and talk about withholding, some of the basics. So that's a great question, right? So kind of taking a step back, when we think about remote, right, when we think about state payroll withholding, and let's just be clear, what we're referring to is the employer's payroll tax withholding obligation on employee wages. So putting COVID-19 to the side, right, generally speaking, if employees are performing employment activities in a state, employers are generally subject to withholding requirements in that state. So that's what we would traditionally see. Now, if it's, kind of get to the crux of the matter, and where and kind of peel this back a little bit further, is that the state where an employee principally lives, right, generally has the primary taxation authority of an individual's income, with a possible offset of a resident credit, which we could talk about in a little bit more detail later today. But however, withholding from employment income is typically, putting COVID-19 aside, is typically based on where the employee actually works. And we'll get through, talk about some exceptions to that later on.
So just a high level example, I live in New Jersey. I work in New York City. Well, let's just call it New York. Normally, my company, Withum, would withhold taxes based on New York, if that's my primary location or the days that I spend there. And then I would file a New York non-resident tax return, and then I would file a New Jersey tax return as a resident here and get a credit for taxes paid to another state. That's the simple, and that's sort of pre-COVID, the world as it used to be. Is that sort of fair? What was happening?
Correct. Yeah. So, residents of a state, as you mentioned, right, they're going to be taxed on all of their income. But in theory, right, the resident state's going to give them a resident credit to offset, double taxation from their work state that they're paying tax in.
So now let's continue to use me as an example. And I haven't perhaps been able to go to New York. I did go to New York, the first couple of months. And now I decided, and New Jersey is an interesting example because I know New Jersey has actually come out with guidance, but we might as well talk about it. I'm now working remotely from New Jersey. What does that mean, since I used to work location-wise, report to people in New York? What does that now mean? And talk to me about this convenience of employer rule that I keep hearing about, and how that factors into my example in New York.
Yeah, so normally, right, you would withhold for your performance working in New York, and now as a result of COVID-19, and traditionally speaking, right, in states, you would start withholding in New Jersey. However, that being said, as you mentioned, New York does have special rules that we'll talk about, called convenience of employer rules, where that they could attribute those wages still to New York, even though you might be working from your home in New Jersey. Also, in addition to that, you brought up a really good point. And now, as we talk about COVID-19, right, one of the immediate concerns is the impact on withholding and whether it should be changed to reflect the employee's actual work location, right, such as New Jersey in maybe your instance. And so, states have put out guidance. Some states have been explicit and put out guidance and saying, well, just because you're working in New Jersey doesn't mean you necessarily have to withhold as an employer in New Jersey. You may continue to withhold in your normal office state. So providing a little bit of relief for that, you might not necessarily have to withhold in some of these locations where you did not withhold pre-COVID-19. New Jersey is one of those states. There's there's a handful of states that have been providing explicit guidance, although most of the states have remained silent.
And if they're silent, What are we advising here? Or there's a practical answer and maybe a pragmatic answer and maybe the technical answer. Because if let's even give another example. If we have a Witham employee that has decided to move to Florida, there's no withholding in Florida. I used to work in New York City, and I didn't have an apartment there. We'll get into that situation. I used to work in New York City, and now I've moved to Florida. There's no withholding. Why would I want to continue paying New York payroll? Is that where we're going with this convenience to the employer rule? Is that actually, will New York actually, do we think that New York will look to employers to continue to withhold New York withholding tax?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So, and let's kind of peel back on the convenience of employer rule and discuss that so everybody's aware of how this functions, and then we could drill down a little bit more. But basically what the rule says, and I mentioned convenience of employer rule, note that there's a handful of states that do employ it, but New York is one of the states that are more aggressive when it comes to actually employing it, although we do see it in a number of states. And basically what it says is, the state has the right to tax all of the employee's earnings if the employee is working outside the state for his or her own convenience, opposed to necessity, right? So when we think about the convenience of employer rule, are they working remotely in their house in Florida or Jersey or wherever it might be, for their convenience or for their necessity? And, it raises some interesting questions because pre-COVID-19, oftentimes we'll have that situation come up, and we end up determining that it's truly convenience opposed to necessity based on the facts and circumstances. However, given that there's a pandemic going on, right, not everybody could necessarily work in New York, and it makes it an interesting question of, would you be working from out of state, out of your convenience during a pandemic when you can't, go to the city, or you're worried about the health effects of going to the city or New York? Is that convenience or is that necessity? And, to date, New York has not responded. They've not provided any guidance on how they're going to view the convenience of employer rule during this pandemic. So, practically speaking, I think what we need to think about is, if you have an employee saying that they're going to move to Florida, is it truly a move? Is it permanent? Is it temporary? What kind of move is it? And just really understanding the facts and circumstances to be able to weigh, how to apply these various withholding considerations when it comes to these rules.
And that's a great point, because I know I was fielding these questions early on in the pandemic, and we were getting them, and people were saying, someone temporarily is going to Florida, whether they had a house there, they're just they can't work in New York. Their buildings have been shut down. And now here we are in September with remote learning and remote telecommuting, and everyone is, wow, here we are 6 months later. And people are starting to think about that as more of a permanent move. Talk to me about the difference between, if somebody literally is moving, they are registering their car, they're going to register to vote, they're moving their children, they're going to school, however they go to school, they're going to be doing that in this new state, they've bought a home. Talk to me about those people that are permanently moving versus, I'm temporarily out of the state, I still have my New York City apartment, and I hate to pick on New York, but we'll definitely talk about other states. But talk to me about the differences. Practically speaking, what should be done right now for 2020?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So let's think about this from the employer's perspective for a moment. So, right, as we mentioned, that withholding traditionally is done based on where the employee works, right? And then an exception to that is this employer convenience rule that says, wait a minute, now you have an employee that's working out of state, but they're working out of state for their own convenience. So they're going to treat those wages as if they were earned in, the state, their office state, right? Where they were assigned, or their primary office. Okay, so that's an exception. As we mentioned, right, New York is one of those states that does that. And as we think about this permanent versus temporary move, right, what we have to think about is, we have an example of an employee who was normally assigned, let's say, to the New York office, right? And now they said, HR, I'm moving to Florida. It's going to be permanent. I don't think I'm coming back. please stop withholding, my wages. And as an employer, we have to say, you know what, would the convenience rule apply? Would we satisfy it, or do we need to treat this employee who's working in Florida, which is there's no state income tax from a personal perspective? Do we need to continue withholding in New York, even though this person's not in New York? They're not working in New York. They're not planning on returning to New York. They bought a home in, I'm sorry, that they bought a home in Florida, and they don't plan on. So, that being said, maybe Gia, it might make sense for us to kind of really go through the rules of the convenience of employer rule and what it means. Okay, so that being said, right, as we think about the convenience of employer rule, this may result in a tax withholding requirement in the office state, regardless of the employees telecommuting from home and working in another state. So under the New York convenience of the employer rule, right, as I mentioned, wages could be attributable to the employee's New York office unless the remote location is for a specific need of the employer as a necessity, opposed to convenience. As a result, right, the wages of an employee working from home in another state continue to be treated as New York wages. And, there are exceptions to this, right?
Okay.
There's strict criteria to determine, what is convenience versus what is necessity. And if you can satisfy that your home office down in Florida is a bona fide office, then you would be exempted from, that employee would be exempted from the convenience of employer rule.
And I understand that those rules are they're kind of hard to meet, right? They're not, a quick checkbox. So could you just high level, maybe just potentially run through why they are hard to meet? And in the past, it's been a little hard to meet those. Some people on the webcast might say, oh yes, that is a bona fide office. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so in determining if a home office is a bona fide employer office or not, you must either meet what they call as either the primary factor, or at least 4 of the secondary factors and 3 of the so-called other factors. And so when we look at the primary factor, right, the primary factor is the home office contains or is near a specialized facility. And what simply this means is that the employee's use of a special facility cannot be made available at the employer's place of business. So New York likes to give the example that if the employee's duties require the use of a test track, to test new cars, and a test track's not available at the employer's offices, but is available near the employee's home, then the home office would satisfy this. So, however, the employee's duties require the use of specialized, like scientific equipment, like for example, that is set up in the employee's home, but could potentially be set up at the employer's place of business, New York would say, well, the home office would not meet this factor. So the primary factor for a lot of our clients, is immediately discounted because it's a really tough bar to satisfy for, based on what our client activities. So that being said, that would then direct us to either the 4 of the secondary and the 3 of the other factors, which we could go through.
Yes, it's definitely, I know it's a tough hurdle to meet. And I also want to go through those high level. I'd also like to understand, because maybe some of our clients on the phone are listening and saying, well, wait a minute, we also have an office in New Jersey, for example. Can't we just say now that all of those employees, well, they just report to the New Jersey office now? Like, why is that difficult? And that seems like an easy fix to this convenience of employer rule. How hard does New York look at this? What factors do they look at before we get into the the other factors you were talking about? Why can't I just make that a fix?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about the convenience of employer rule, right? So who is it going to affect? It's going to affect employees who are quote unquote, primarily assigned to the New York office. Well, can't we just reassign, that employee to New Jersey or, another state where we might have an office? But not so quick, because the way New York is going to define where you're assigned is going to be based on where the employee reports to, right? Where are its supervisors located? Who is evaluating that employee? Who does that employee's performance review? Where does that employee send its deliverables, its work product? If it's all New York, right, maybe on paper they're being reassigned to the New Jersey office, but under audit, New York could say, right, this is a New York employee, so even though you might have on paper reassigned the employee, in effect, this employee is still working as if it's a New York employee. And so unless you meet the exceptions as an employer convenience rule as a bona fide office, you would still otherwise be affected by this rule.
So 2020 is kind of hard because we had the office and I was in the right, we're in the office part of the year, but there could be some planning opportunities then maybe for 2021 if this situation continues with remote employees. I'm not going back to that home state. I mean, what types of planning around this New York convenience of employer rule are there, and what should companies be thinking about? Do you have, if you never step foot into New York, does that get around this rule? What happens in 2021, just looking forward?
Yeah, so those are all great questions. So this rule is not going to apply if you physically never step into the New York
Okay.
office at all
Mhm.
during the year.
Okay.
But a lot of our remote employees, at least
Right.
pre-pandemic, they might be working from home, but they
Mhm.
might come up to the New York office, let's say once every couple of months, right? That alone could trigger the convenience of employer rule unless you're meeting the bona fide office exception.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, the question remains, as I mentioned earlier, is, would during a pandemic, are you really working out of your house,
Right.
out of convenience or necessity? And a possible argument might be able to be made that employees were likely not working remotely for their own convenience while
Mhm.
shelter-in-place orders were in effect. But as states reopen and employees continue to work remotely, the issue is certainly becoming less clear. And if these were employees that were, remote pre-COVID-19, I think that argument goes out the window that the pandemic had any effect. So these are things that we definitely need to think about in terms of planning, right?
Mhm.
If you have multiple offices, clearly there's at least an possible argument to be made. All right, let's see how we can examine reassigning this employee to our LA office or,
Right.
another state that doesn't apply this similar type of rule. And how do we, document that this person's truly, working for the LA office and that would not otherwise be working for the New York office? Are we going to move most of the people out of New York, maybe? Are we going to move most of its supervisors out of New York? And kind of playing around which employees might make more sense that we could reassign to get around, this rule from applying, opposed to which employees, might it be a more difficult challenge. So, it's something that certainly can be examined.
Yeah, so why don't you just quickly run through some of those factors so people listening can think of maybe ways to plan for it or plan to be exempt from this rule.
Yeah, sure. So again, we have to meet the secondary factors and the
Mhm.
so-called other factors. And usually when we go through the list with a lot of clients, right, to meet 4 of the secondary factors, we often do come up with about 3 of them. And then sometimes,
Yeah.
again, it's facts and circumstances. And then coming up with the 4th one, sometimes, believe it or not, is difficult. There's 6 of them of the secondary factors. So you got to meet 4 of the 6. And just to kind of give you a little taste of what some of these
Mhm.
factors are and what it takes to meet them. One of them is that the home office is a requirement or condition of employment. So what you're going to want to make sure is that you have an updated employment agreement with your employees to make sure that you satisfy this, right? So that way, under audit, that you can say, well, this was a requirement of employment to work from home. There is no office location for this employee. They are to work from home and perform specific duties as assigned to them. And then you can meet that one factor. So that would be one of the 4 factors that you might be able to meet. Obviously, you might want to consider updating, employment contracts to satisfy that. Another requirement is that the employer has a bona fide business purpose for the employee's home office location. We often find this requirement, sometimes hard to satisfy. It requires that the employer has a bona fide business purpose for establishing an office in the locale where, the employee's home office is located. So, for example, if the employee is, let's say, an engineer working on several projects in his or her home state, and it's necessary that the employee has an office near these projects to meet different deadlines and different jobs, then the home office would meet this factor. Oftentimes what we find is that a lot of our clients, right, we have remote employees because, it's simply, they'd like to work from home, and not necessarily always because it's a geographic region. And so sometimes that item is hard to meet. Continuing on here, Gia. Yeah. Is that another factor here of the secondary factors is that the employee performs some of their core duties at her employment or his employment at the home office. So this one's usually a little bit easier to meet, right? As long as you could say, well, some of the core duties are being performed at home. So, if you're, let's say, again, an engineer, IT engineer, and you're performing your normal day-to-day core activities at home, then you can satisfy this. Obviously, documentation is always important, but we always, we find generally that item is a little bit easier to meet.
Is that one easy? Is it important that the employer is reimbursing not just for maybe the internet connection and things like that, but is it to be that true home office? We're all kind of working from home right now. Does that mean that I just have a home office because I've plugged my computer in at home, or does the company actually have to reimburse me for some of my expenses?
So that's a great question. So that's one of the factors. So that if you can meet that fourth factor, so if you get the three ones that might be a little bit easier, and there's a one that exactly if the employer is reimbursing the expenses for a home office, which sometimes we struggle for some of our clients to meet, but if they can satisfy that one, then you can potentially reach all of the four factors and of the secondary group, and potentially have a bona fide office. So absolutely, if you have an employer, and I think the way they'll define it is that when they talk about substantially reimbursing the expenses, you have to meet 80% or more of the expenses. So what we're looking at and what we're thinking about are utility expenses, insurance, any expense related to the home office, or the fair rental value, right? What does it cost if you had rented out a WeWork for a small one-person office? If you're reimbursing the employee 80% or more of the expenses, then that would be one of the factors. And sometimes that's a hard factor to reach for some of our clients. But so that's an area though that can be explored.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, and as you're saying them, I think, well, I can meet that one, but I think as we get into it more specifically, they are a little harder to meet based on, the current law. I just want to turn it over to Lady just for a minute. You're hearing, we're trying so hard to, make sure that the payroll withholding requirements are met. But let's say that New York asserts this convenient to the employer rule, right? And I won't use Florida because I know that's not a good example. I'll use California. I'm going to use as an example. And, I have an employee now, they're working there, but New York's going to say, well, no, those wages are really New York. Does California care? And are they going to say, you have an employee working there?
Yeah.
And now you have nexus in California,
Yeah, it's a tricky question. So listening to Jason, my head is like spinning. I can just relate to the pain that some of our clients are going through. Maybe Jason, something to think about. Would it make a difference if the workspace is open, but going in the office is optional versus mandatory, right? Because I start thinking about that. But when it comes to California, California is a tricky state for sales tax purposes. When I hear the word, well, we have people there, automatically you have nexus, right? Payroll or not, 1099 holders, you have nexus because you are, you've created a connection. So going back to what nexus means, is it creating a relationship, a connection with the state, that now the state can come back to you and say, well, you're responsible for collecting tax in our state. So for sales tax purposes, that connection is created so easily that, having payroll definitely makes it a lot stronger, the connection, because now you're in the system and it's hard to say that you don't have nexus. But California is a tricky one because there is due to economic nexus, there is remote seller nexus, and there's also physical nexus. So for sales tax purposes, if you have a physical presence, having payroll in the state, you may have different sales tax obligation, which means that you have a different sales tax rate that you have to collect. So this is super important in states like Texas, California, Louisiana, Colorado, because you can go from being a remote seller, which in some states there may be one tax rate that you can use, or there are some advantages to being a remote seller, meaning you don't have physical presence. Then when payroll is established, you kind of get stripped away from those benefits. And what that means is that now you may have to file local sales tax returns with local jurisdictions, and maybe in a state like Louisiana or Colorado, and or you may have to collect a different sales tax rate. So definitely super important to understand really, what is happening. Now, if I have a client that says to me, hey, we're moving temporary, I say, okay, did you change the payroll filings, right? I always go back to, did you change the payroll filings? Because if you're just sitting outside of your mom's house in California, making this up for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, then and you haven't changed the payroll filings, you definitely have nexus, but you are not really established in the sense where you're in the system, the state is aware of your payroll filings. So it's a bit different. It definitely causes a conversation to be had. Once you change the payroll filings to having California sales payroll taxes being withdrawn, then it's a whole different type of conversation. But I guess on my end, what I liked the listeners to take out of this is that, and what I'm taking out of from listening to Jason too, that it's super complex and it's very state driven. There are no set rules for every state. Sales tax has been that way for a while. I think this also adds more complexities to it. So, just kind of be aware of the payroll filings, be aware of what the company is doing, and then reach out to your tax team to have those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing from both of you, and really why we're having this presentation is, of course, as companies, we want to make sure you're protected for payroll taxes, right? As Jason said, is a lot of you are on the webcast are thinking, how is that possible? How can New York do this? Well, that is the law. And we just want to bring you the law today. It doesn't mean it's the pragmatic or what you actually will do in common practice. I think it is probably an employee by employee analysis that needs to be done. But what I am hearing is, if my employee can go into quote ADP and just quickly change their withholding without informing HR or informing finance, that could be a risk for the company. And I do think that's a big takeaway for today, that you need to be well informed, because again, this can create sales tax issues for the company. It could create income tax issues for the company, shortages of payroll withholding, and just there's many other taxes, as Lady was even saying, local compliance jurisdictions, just by one person clicking on a state where maybe you weren't before. So
Yeah.
I think that's the most important thing today to take away from the broadcast. Does the company need a policy? If employees are moving, who do they need to notify? Who do they need to let them know? And then does analysis need to be done? What does that mean for the company? And again, we're focusing today on the employer only. We're not focusing on what does this mean for the employee. There's considerations there as well. So Jason, I don't think we kind of hit on payroll, we kind of hit on sales tax a little bit. Just talk to me about income tax. If I've triggered payroll, does that automatically mean that now I trigger income tax as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think to kind of answer that, we got to differentiate between clients that are selling tangible property versus service-based clients. And the reason why I say that is that when it comes to clients that are generating revenue based on anything outside of tangible, so service clients, most likely a lot of those clients probably already have economic nexus. which essentially, by having a virtual presence in another state, would trigger economic nexus, and as a result, COVID-19, post COVID-19, putting that aside, they would have otherwise had nexus, and so that payroll might or might not actually have any actual bearing on a filing. Now, technically speaking, by having payroll or physical presence in the state, you're going to have a filing requirement. There are certain measures that states are putting into place because of the pandemic, relief measures saying, well, corporate income tax or business income tax nexus is not being triggered as a result of having this temporary presence in the state because of the pandemic. So for companies that sell tangible product, that might be more important to them because there might be protection that's provided under federal law, what's called federal 86272, public law 86272, that might provide them some protection. So I think making that distinction between clients that are selling tangible versus service oriented revenues, I think it probably that physical presence is going to matter more so to companies selling tangible property, and to our service clients, they've most likely already had, in most cases, economic nexus, so it probably would be less relevant to them.
Understood. Wanted to take a minute here. I do see some questions coming through the chat. I guess Jason's factors. We're getting a lot of questions around them. People understood, right? I mean, if you can get around the convenience of employer rule, if you can create the bona fide office, this is much less of an issue. Again, still need to think about income tax nexus, still need to think about sales tax nexus, but maybe the New York withholding, is easier to not have to deal with. But people want to know where they can actually find those factors. We will be posting this on the Withum website when the presentation is over. We'll have a slide that talks about the convenience of employer rules. If at any time you want clarifications or anything, you can reach out. We'll put our contact information up again, during this presentation. We know how important those factors are. We just didn't want to spend the whole webcast, diving into all those factors. So that would be the place where you can view them. Okay, we'll do that. All the questions I'm seeing right now. Here's a very specific question. Our company has an office in New York that's been officially closed. It's the employer's decision to close that office. Would employees working from home be considered a necessity? And it's the question of the day, I think, because what is New York going to say is a necessity? And again, we know New York, right? We all live here or in the surrounding areas, or I know this broadcast is going out to many, for us that are close to the big boy states, the Californias and the New Yorks of the world. We know how aggressive these states can be, and we started by saying the current climate is that these states have a large shortfall. So Jason, kind of just talk to me, this is the question we're getting. What do we think practically and technically?
Yeah, so as we've mentioned, right, New York is facing significant budget shortfalls, and New York has yet to comment on their interpretation of the convenience of employer rule during the pandemic. It is really uncertain if states with such laws would provide an exemption with respect, to the pandemic that we're seeing, or if the state would make a distinction between voluntary or encouraged work from home initiatives versus mandatory work from home orders. Because as the state again is opening up, and we have some businesses that are voluntarily continuing to encourage work from home, keep the offices shut. It really is uncertain. And so, understanding, the environment that we're in, and, the New York budget shortfall, what has to be looked at is some of the, risks that are associated with changing employer withholding during the time of pandemic. So, it's something that has to be considered for sure.
Yeah, it is crazy. Is it our, I don't want to give a specific recommendation, but does it make sense if I'm listening to this broadcast, I'm unsure how New York's going to treat this, to just leave withholdings as they are, especially with somebody that maybe even has that New York City apartment, maybe you want to come back. Does it just sort of just make sense? Why don't we just leave New York withholding the way it is for 2020? Is that, again, I know there's the technical answer and the practical answer, but I want to make sure people take away from this. And again, this advice is general. But what are we really seeing here?
Yeah, possibly that might be the right answer for certain clients. The
Yeah.
thing is you have to think about is that if you have employees working in other states, so for example, let's say you had a
Hmm.
couple employees now working from home in Massachusetts. Well, as we discussed earlier, Matt, right, in most states, wherever you're performing employment obligation, you're subject to withholding. So Massachusetts would suggest, you should be withholding in their state for the time that you're working from home, those employees that are working from home. So we have to consider the risks of, how many employees do you have in different states, right? You might only have one employee or two employees, let's say, working from Massachusetts versus having 50 employees in New York. And you might be saying, well, you know what? Let's leave everything status quo, right? Pre-pandemic status quo, continue withholding in New York, not do anything in Massachusetts, because the risk in Massachusetts for two employees is a lot less than the risk in New York. And, that makes most sense. Obviously every state has their own guidance. Every state has their own technical answer. The practical answer might be status quo. It
Yeah.
depends on, the facts and circumstances of each client.
And let's just talk about, I know we spent a lot of time talking about New York and picking on New York. You had mentioned in the beginning, there's a couple of states like New Jersey, for example, that have actually come out with, some guidance and believe it or not, saying, hey, because of COVID, we're going to say that does not create an excess or does not create this additional withholding. Do we have charts or anything we can share after this webcast of some, at least we know this is, as far as I see it, this changes every day. But do we have a list of states that have put out guidance and states that have stayed silent on this right now that maybe we could share with our audience?
Yeah, so a lot of that guidance came out early on in the
Mhm.
pandemic where states were providing some explicit guidance. And we've written an article or two that we could share that kind of discusses some of the different states and what we were seeing. As of late, there hasn't been as much guidance, only for the fact that a lot of the states are opening up and are attempting to go back to more, normal times, so to speak, whatever normal is. But what we've seen though, when a lot of this guidance has come out, is three different types of state guidance, and you'll notice that in some of our publications that we've put out externally, is that either one, right, states have said, you know what, there's no change, right, just traditional withholding. So if
Mhm.
you have an employee working in Massachusetts now, withhold in Massachusetts. That's what they would say. So that there would be no conflict, right? You would know how to withhold. It was easy, at least. And then the employers would decide, you know what, if I have an employee there for 2 months, should I bother withholding or not? That was an employer decision at that point. Um, Number two, what we've seen is some states say, uh, keep status quo. Don't change withholding. So if you were, withholding, if you're a Pennsylvania business, you've been withholding in Pennsylvania, now you have employees outside the state, continue withholding in PA. Almost in effect, the convenience of employer rule they were suggesting, but it was more from an administrative standpoint, unlike New York's statutory provision. And the third were more like relief states, like New Jersey, that said, you know what, you don't necessarily have to withhold in our state. You can continue withholding in the office state if you like, providing relief where that, you don't necessarily have to withhold or you don't necessarily have nexus. And there were a number of states that put out relief. So we could share that article that kind of goes through the different states and what we've, seen so far, to, just provide a little bit of color. But again, these are temporary regulations, temporary orders, temporary bulletins that the states have put out. It's unclear when they come to an end. Oftentimes, the way they're worded, it says during emergency order, emergency period. Does that mean when the work from home period ends and now it's, voluntarily you can go back to the office? Does that mean that these these bulletins and this guidance comes to an end? A lot of it's really unclear. So we might be looking at some of these states that have put out guidance that are no longer valid anymore. So we could send that out, and
Sure.
it's really facts and circumstances. That's what it comes down to.
So we have another question that just came through the chat. We have a New Jersey office and are recently hiring employees who live in different states. Am I understanding that this convenience of in the employer rule does not apply to them and that the company just handles out-of-state withholding as required by that state?
And this in a home office is
In New Jersey.
in New Jersey. Yeah, so provided that New Jersey doesn't have a convenience of employer rule, then yeah, just traditional withholding would be required. So if they're working, let's say in Kansas, and Kansas has an income tax, you would want to, and this person's going to be a permanent employee, right? They're not just going to work there for a month and then you're going to move them back to Jersey when the pandemic's over. You would certainly want to make sure you're withholding on that employee in Kansas.
Excellent, excellent. So as we sort of wrap up and come to the last, couple minutes of this broadcast, let's summarize some takeaways. What should employers be thinking about? What conversations should they be having internally? What do you want them to take away from this? And I'll start with Lady.
So for me, I think what's important is to think through it. A lot of my clients kind of rush into the decision of whether it is to say, applying to payroll, well, we're moving into Massachusetts, we should withdraw or file Massachusetts payroll tax, or we should collect sales tax. And my advice there is just don't rush through it. Make sure you talk to someone, make sure that's the right decision for you, make sure there's a valid reason why you want to switch things. I see a lot of my clients come to me and they say, well, we're not sure what's happening, but we're thinking maybe closing the office. Well, that's not really closing the office, right? It's thinking about it. I think 2020 is just kind of a weird year for everyone. Perhaps there is ways that you can plan in 2021. I just wouldn't make any rush decisions in what happened in 2020. And I'll kind of circle back what that means for sales tax. Once you register, it's hard to deregister, right?
Yeah.
So, and once you started collecting, now you have to remit. So, and you have to, meaning you have to remit, you have to register, and you can't deregister at least in a year or two from when you registered. And there has to be a good reason, right? So a lot of my clients hear these type of webinars or podcasts or read things, they get paranoid and scared, and they all of a sudden change things automatically, which it's good intentions, but it doesn't mean that it's the right thing for them to do. Some of these things, it really requires some due diligence and some thinking behind it to make sure it's the right thing to do for the business. So, like I said, for sales tax purposes, it's hard. If you start collecting, I have to remit the tax. I have a company that started collecting 100 different sales tax rates in Louisiana, but now we have to remit this to all these local jurisdictions. There's really no way around that. And it's going to be thousands of dollars to manage that over a very small potential liability. So definitely contact your tax team, definitely contact us, kind of go through those options for you or best options for you and make a decision driven by that. So that is my takeaway.
Thank you for that. And Jason, there are a couple more questions, but what is your overall, just takeaway? What do you want companies to be thinking about here? For as Lady said, 2020 is a weird year for sure.
Yeah, so practically speaking, what we need to be doing is we need to be reviewing the existing and post-pandemic footprint. Where are we going to be? Where are we currently now? What's the plans, as Lady indicated, right? And then let's examine the impacted states. So isolate the states that, the business might be affected. Obviously thinking about materiality. You might have 50 employees at the business, then in New York, now you got 10 in Jersey, 15 in Connecticut, and then a bunch of rest scattered throughout the country, right? Let's really look at the larger states first, deal with those, right? That's where the materiality is. And then let's look at the smaller states and look at, let's look at the impacted states and see what makes sense. And, really just then, just implement reporting withholding procedures, right? Then that starts, not just with tax, but with HR and legal and all the different stakeholders. So that way, we have a system that is designed to work, that makes sense, where the employees can't just change withholding maybe without getting approval or having some sort of discussion, and just making sure that there's no unintended consequences. So yeah, legal, marketing, HR, IT, everybody should be part of the decision making. And then it's just time to review, right? It's time to take a look at those impacted states and put into the procedures and make sure, that it's working and it makes sense, and revisit. It's coming up with thresholds, right? You might have an employee in the state for 3 weeks. Maybe that's not long enough. Maybe that's not material enough to make a change. Coming up with thresholds that, that everyone's comfortable with, and policies and procedures to put everything into place in respect to the impacted states.
Yeah, great advice from both of you. Just one last question I see on the screen is, do the cities, local jurisdictions, do they follow the state rules for the cities that I guess
Absolutely not. Not all the time. Not all the time. Definitely not City of Denver, City of Chicago. Those are the two big cities that totally have a different standing on some of the SaaS products and things like that. But on the sourcing side, which is super important on companies that have payroll and things like that, they change. So the local jurisdictions, especially in the states where there are separate local jurisdictions that administer separately and they have their own statutes and regs, they don't follow state regulations all the time, just on certain topics, but it's not safe to assume that they follow all the time.
To make it even more complex, right? And how many local jurisdictions are there, lady?
There's just so many. There's just so many. My main concerns in local jurisdictions are Louisiana, because they are some of the local jurisdictions are independently run and they have their own statutes. So think about finding statutes that are written by a specific city. It's fun. But so Louisiana, Colorado, and then some other different independent local jurisdictions have their own rules, and different rules in sourcing, different rules in taxability. And some of the times, or not some of the times, but 60% of the times, they don't publish those rules. So then we have to ask what the rules are. So definitely not fun for some of my clients, for sure.
And Jason, I know we've already beat up New York City, but I know, for example, California, right? San Francisco has a gross receipts / payroll liability. LA, gross receipts taxes. They all have these taxes, whether payroll based or not. But if you've created nexus in their jurisdiction, do they sort of follow the states there too?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, is that, if you have employees in these different localities that tax, from an employer, from a business standpoint, definitely keep an eye out on that. So, the big ones are, as you mentioned, are Los Angeles, San Francisco. Everybody obviously knows New York City, Philadelphia. It's worth making sure that if you're in a larger city, see what the tax impact is, if any. And maybe it's just a filing requirement. Doesn't always necessarily mean it's a significant tax. It might just be, making sure that we're complying so that there's no non-compliance penalties or anything along those lines. So definitely keep an eye out with the localities, because they have different rules, different tax bases, and they could come into effect. You might be taxable in a state for Pennsylvania, even though you have an employee in Philly, doesn't mean it would apply. It just really depends on the facts and circumstances. So.
Yeah, so thank you both, Lady and Jason. I hope that there are some good takeaways from this broadcast. As Lady said, this is complex, and certainly hope you enjoyed it today. Our contact information is on the screen right now, as well as we'll be adding this to the Withum website, which is withum.com. And we look forward for hearing from you, and I hope everyone stays safe and healthy. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care.